Okay.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. All right, great. So I've turned off my video just so I don't see myself moving around, or you don't see myself moving around in the corners. Well, you won't because you're seeing my screen. Anyway, welcome. My name is Becky Gibson. I'm the Senior Accessibility Strategist at Knowbility. I'm here to talk to you about some basic HTML accessibility techniques that you can use as you're building your programs. And basically, it's how to rock the AIR judging form. There are some links within this presentation. They resolve to the AIR training that you folks have access to on our Knowbility's Learning website at learning.knowbility.org. I believe you've received an access code to get access to that training. I know I've seen that some of you have logged in. So let's get started.
And just a quick tip, if you guys on the line could mute your phone. Thanks for that suggestion, Kara. Hey, Becky, we can't hear you. Can you guys hear Becky?
Nope, you can't. I was muted.
No.
Sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, we guess we better go back.
Perfect. Round two.
I know. It's not going back. That's my problem. There we go. Okay, so we're here. Sorry. You're here to become accessibility rock stars. That's the whole idea of AIR. It's to help build, increase accessibility for websites, different websites, and it's to train people and help you learn about accessibility. So my goal is to make you rock stars. So we base everything on the judging form. So the judging form is in the training. The links that you see within here are in that training, and you all were given a code for that to access that training at learning.knowbility.org. And the judging form is based on WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're from the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and they're sort of the de facto standard for guidelines for making the web more accessible. They're based on 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. There are 12, I think there's 13 guidelines now underneath that. And within each guideline, there are success criteria. So you'll hear me talking about success criteria. And what I've highlighted here is column A of the judging form shows you the success criteria number that each of the accessibility requirements are based upon. So with that, let's dive in, and I'm going through them in the order of the judging form, which is also fairly close to the order of how they are in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So first we start out with images. I hope, maybe you should have heard, hopefully by now, that images need alt text, alternative text. And why is that? Because a lot of people access the computer with a screen reader. So especially people who are blind, they have the screen read to them and they navigate with the keyboard. So imagine that you're coming in, and in this case, you might have images that are useful and ones that are just decorative. So what happens when a screen reader encounters an image is they will read this alternative text if it's there. Otherwise, they will read the image name. So in this case, we have a case where I'm showing, first off, a image that is purely decorative, because we have here, it says today's weather is sunny. That's in text. The screen reader will speak that. Then there's a picture of the sun. Well, the screen reader really already has the information. The sun is there to visually enhance the text, and we would put what we call null or empty alt text. In this case, if we're looking at the code, we would put just an empty, an attribute with no value. This is what this alt attribute is. Now, I know many of you will be using content management systems, and you should be aware that almost all of them, that the ones I know, the major ones, all allow you to enter text. So sometimes you can't enter empty alt text, so you may have to actually put in a value. So that all, I probably should have started with the next slide, where in this case, the image does convey meaning, okay? If somebody with a screen reader encounters this, or somebody has images turned off in their browser, they would just see today's weather, and either they would hear sun.png, and in that case, that's sort of, you could figure it out, but a lot of times image names that I've seen on websites have, 7723657 blah, da, dot JPEG, which doesn't mean anything. So in this case, we must add an alternative text. In this case, I've put in sunny. So that would say, the screen reader would say, today's weather, sunny. Or if images were turned off or not loading because a person has a bad connection or slow connection, they would see the word sunny there. So anyway, images, think about that. If it's a decorative image, we need to tell the screen reader it's decorative by giving it this empty alt text. If it's not, then we have to describe the image so it's available to everyone. Here's some examples. For example, if I get redirected to a web page because I've won a contest and there's this great text that says you win, it's an image, then if it doesn't have correct alt text, I might not know that if I have my images turned off or if I have a screen reader. So just an example. Another one is if the text fully describes the image, you don't necessarily need the alt text. So if we're looking at a page that's describing birds and we hear this picture that has the robin, it tells us the size, it tells us the color, it describes it, and then we have a picture next to it, we don't want to repeat all that alt text. So in that case, because we've correctly described it, fully described it in the text, we would put an empty alt text. So the next thing we jump to is hyperlinks. So think about when you see how many websites or places have you been where you see a little blurb about an article and then it says read more or click here to do something. And there's read more, read more, read more at the end of each paragraph or blurb. So what happens with a screen reader is they have a way, people using a screen reader, to pull up a list of links on the page. So in this case, I'm showing a screenshot of the VoiceOver screen reader. The VoiceOver screen reader, if you have a Mac, you get that with your with the Mac on OS X. So, and it has a very good tutorial for how to use it. But you can pull up a list of links, and a user would go through those links and then pick which one they want to navigate to. But as you can see here, a read more, click here doesn't really give them much information. So you want to think about incorporating the text into your link. So the example I took here was rather than saying, read more, I said, learn how to complete all your assignments on time. And I made all of that the link. And then the same thing with the avoid the freshman 5 weight gain. I made that entire phrase the link. And I could have also just put weight gain or something smaller. But anyway, so the idea is to, okay, somebody needs to mute, I think. because I'm getting an echo. Okay. So anyway, you want the link text to be descriptive, right? Rather try to avoid those read more, click here, learn more repetitive links, because now if I pulled up that list of links, you can see that they're much more useful and easy to navigate with. And I should mention that it's not only people who are blind that use screen readers. Some people with low vision who can see some will use them. Other people, if they're learning a second language, it helps to hear it as well as see it. Or some people with cognitive disabilities learn better by hearing, so they will also use a screen reader. So it's helpful to have the text be descriptive. Okay, so that was the hyperlink text item on the form. The next one we talk about is semantic markup. Now, if you're using a content management system, you don't always have control over this, but most of them, give you the option of using adding your own HTML, but at least use the elements that are there properly. So you need to, if you're coding, begin and end all elements properly, nest things properly, and we'll see that when we talk about headings. Unique ID values, if you're coding, you'll know what that means. Use a proper heading structure, and don't use tables for layout, which you could use a table to lay things out in your content management system, because most of them offer the opportunity to put tables. You want to not use a table to lay it out, because people rely on tables, screen readers in particular. They have a certain navigation way to go through that, and we want everything to flow properly, but not using a table. So there's a validator that you can get free from the W3C, and you can give it a URL and it will check your HTML for you and validate it. So you should use that. I talked about using correct semantic structure. Headings are one thing. Everybody should use headings, right? We want to provide, headings provide a visual overview of a page for those of us that can see it, and they're styled differently. Well, sometimes people will they'll just take a div, which is a generic element, and they'll give you they'll give it a class that says, here's my cool heading. Well, that doesn't work. That's not defining it. That no longer is a heading. So just like screen readers can pull up a list of links, they can pull up a list of headings and use that to navigate on the page. There's another way to do that where you can give it a role equals heading, and that's okay. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, because I'm guessing most of you will use a content management system like WordPress. And then the correct way to do it, absolutely correct way, is to actually use the H1 element. Use the elements for the purpose that's why they're there. So just to give you an example of that, here's a way of doing the heading. So if I do a correct topic heading with an H1, it comes out in that list of headings. If you look at that second one here, where it's just a generic element, a div, that's styled to look like a heading, that doesn't show up over here in this list of headings that the screen reader will display. And then again, I can use ARIA, which I'm not going to go into at this point, but ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's mostly used with JavaScript to allow you to add more semantic information to anything that you've scripted with a control. But that one, because I've used that correctly, it will come out as a heading. Again, lists. There's bunches of ways, a lot of, you could make a list different ways in HTML. You can put in an asterisk, you can use CSS or cascading style sheets to shift things over and indent them.
I'm doing good, thank you.
And why would you wouldn't want to do that, right? You have HTML to do all that, right? We have a UL, an unordered list element. We have an ordered list element, and all the content management systems have them. And there are ways, if you don't like the bullet style, to change the bullet style. So if you have a list, make it a list, because when a screen reader, when it encounters a list, will say that it's a list, it will tell the user how many elements there are in the list and in what element they are. So they're on element 1 of 3 or 2 of 3. So it gives them a much more information if it's styled correctly using semantic HTML. Right. So basically follow the spec.
Right.
So the next thing is skip links. So skip links, I don't know if if you go to a website and you use the keyboard, a lot of times there's a skip link there that allows you to skip to the main content of the page. And the reason for that is for keyboard users. So this is a screenshot of the Knowbility site, and we have a fairly small menu on our site. But if somebody comes in and they start tabbing through the page, which is how we navigate with the keyboard on the web page, they can easily get to this thing, and when they get to this first item it makes this skip to main content visible on the screen, and they can press that link and skip directly into the main content of the page. Now with the Knowbility page, where we don't have a really deep menu, it's not so bad. But I encourage you to go look at a site like Starbucks or LL Bean or someplace that has a very shopping sites or whatever tend to have very big menus to go through. And if you had to go through that with the keyboard just to get to the main content every time, it would be really tedious. Right. So that's why these skip links are important, to let the keyboard user, whether that's a sighted keyboard user or somebody who has low vision or is blind, then it allows them to quickly skip to the main content of the page, which is important if you're used to going to a site all the time, right? You don't want to have to go through that entire news site menu just to get to today's headlines, for example. Landmarks are another way that we can help people navigate, screen readers navigate. They add structure and they help the screen reader user navigate. It's one of my pet peeves that the browsers don't give a way for a user to pull up a list of headings or a list of landmarks and to navigate, because as a keyboard user, I use the keyboard a lot, and I would rather be able to just skim that way by pulling up a list of headings than I would just using the mouse all the time. But anyway, that's my pet peeve. It is important for screen readers. And when you use semantic HTML, you get these landmarks on the page. So if you see, I've sort of outlined them in that dashed blue, where the Knowbility top of it is outlined, that's the header element. There's the nav element, assigns your navigation. And then if you use a main element, it will show you what the main part of the page is. And that becomes important when you're implementing the skip links. And so I've talked about, I'm assuming a lot of you will use a content management system like WordPress, and be aware that there are templates for WordPress that are accessible. So you may want to start with those so you get the benefit of all these, because without having to do any custom work to your WordPress site. So headings for navigation. So we talked about landmarks, and headings are a part of somewhat of a landmark. And so it's important. I said things have to be nested properly. So in this case, I'm showing you, you have generally only one heading level 1 for your page. That's your title or your main heading on the page. And then you would have H2 for important topics. If you have another heading within a topic, then you go down another level, in this case, H3. And then when we go back up to a high level topic again, we're at H2. We go down to H3 to talk about different subtopics. And then if necessary, we add a subtopic with an H4. So basically this is an outline. If you're used to outlining, creating an outline for a document, or it's almost like a table of contents, you need that. You need to go in order, and you cannot skip levels. So in that case, if I saw that H3 and I followed it with an H5, that would be an error, because we want everything to be hierarchical. And you need to, no, that thought just went away, but that's fine. So headings, they're good for navigating. A screen reader pulls up those lists of headings and they can navigate by it on the page. So now we're talking about information in the presentation layer. So you can't, click the green button to check your work may work for people that can see the screen, but what if somebody's colorblind and there's several different buttons, a green button, a yellow button, a purple button, and they all do something different, and they can't distinguish those colors from one another. Or somebody with a screen reader isn't going to know which one is the green button, so they're not going to be able to do that. So you need to make sure that if you provide the information in text, so don't rely on just the color alone. So I've updated that example to say, click the green check button to check your work. And another thing is this text down at the bottom where it says, don't rely on color alone to distinguish items. So we have a link here that is in blue and the rest of the text is gray. And it's only color that differentiates it. Now that would be okay as long as when it gets focus, we do something to make it look more like a link and to show it has focus and it is an active element. But it's really better to add that additional style from the beginning to identify it as a link, like underline is the default generally for a link to show that it's a link. And you can use a color as well. And the other thing is I'm going to talk about color contrast on the next slide, but one of the things I want to point out on this slide is, that blue is not all that distinguishable from the gray. Now this meets the color contrast guidelines we're going to talk about in a minute, because blue against white and the gray against white are valid valid contrast ratios. But notice that those colors are fairly similar, and somebody with any vision issues might have trouble telling that shows a link is actually a link. So the underline really helps them as well. So color contrast basically says that there are requirements that images or text has to have a ratio between the foreground and the background. So the text against the background has to meet these particular ratios. So 4.5 to 1 is what it needs if you have text that's smaller than 24 pixels or 18.66 pixels if it's bold. Then it has to have a ratio of 4.5 to 1 of the text against the background color, or if it's bigger text, it needs a ratio of 3 to 1. So I've given you some examples on the left-hand side. So I'm using a black text on a green background, and that has a really good ratio of 14.6 to 1. So it passes at 14 pixels. Oh yeah, it should be, that slide's wrong. It should say 14 pixels, not 24 on the first one. And it passes at the 24 pixels because it's way beyond 4.5 to 1. Now, if we go to this red text on a yellow background, the contrast ratio is only 4.4 to 1. So that fails for the 14 pixel. And again, I'm sorry, this first bullet is wrong. It should say 14. And because it's not 4.5, but it passes when it's in a bigger size. And then if we go down to this white text on a pink background, that contrast ratio is 2.1 to 1. So that fails at both the smaller size, 14 pixel, and the larger size of 24 pixels. And there are a lot of tools for testing this and helping you pick colors. So before you get, check on your colors when you're in design mode to make sure that you're going to meet these contrast ratios. And those tools, different options for those tools are listed in the training materials. So then we get to keyboard. I've talked to about keyboard a little bit already. All elements have to work with the keyboard. So anything that's interactive that you can use with the mouse has to also work with the keyboard. So a lot of times I'll see when I'm looking at sites that developers have tested that they will do this generic element with a div, and they will add an event handler so that when somebody clicks it, it will do something. That's wrong. And again, hopefully you're going to be using a content management system and not hand coding this, but just you need to make sure everything works with only the keyboard so that you can get rid of your mouse and still navigate the site. And I put a link here to a blog post on the Knowbility site that tells you how to learn to navigate and test with the keyboard. Gives you the keystrokes that work. And another thing to remember here is if you use the default controls that are built into HTML, the inputs, the text fields, the radio buttons and checkbox, they all work with the keyboard from right out of the box. So that's another thing. And if you use the built-in controls and don't add too many add-ons in your content management system, those will work as well. And then now we get to another geeky thing, was identify the language of the page. So why that's important, and that needs to be done in the HTML. Most content management systems will do that correctly for you, but you should check on that. And you can do that by inspecting the code. You need help, somebody that's a little bit more familiar with HTML to inspect the code. But the reason we do this is so that the screen reader knows how to pronounce the words. So if you want to say, if you are creating a site in Spanish, say, and the entire page is in Spanish, but you think a lot of your audience may be speak English as well, you want to identify the language as Spanish for the whole page so that the screen reader will speak that Spanish language properly and not try and will pronounce it properly. You also need to identify pieces of language within the page, and I think we get to that in the next session. Forms, you must have, form controls must have programmatically determined labels. And you're like, wow, what the heck does that mean, right? What's this programmatically determined? Basically, you need to make sure that your label is associated with your control. And visual text is always the best option. So don't rely on people, just guessing that your layout, or don't rely on, I never forget this word. I never remember this word. Don't rely on the text that you can put placeholder text to show what something is. So basically, again, I'm showing code here. Most of the content management systems will do this correctly if you, add a label and make a text label. Basically, what we're doing here is the input field, or the text field, has an ID, and that value is ADDR. And so I've associated that, I've said that the label element is for that particular control, and here's the visible text for that label. So again, always make sure that you have everything labeled and it's visible. I think I'm going to skip the next page just in the interest of time. There are other ways, if you insist on having a image for a label, that you can also provide a programmatic connection between them. That's not a very good practice. That's not a good practice, so I'm not going to dive into that. And then we have one called label and name. This is a newer one. This has been added to the judging form this year. And it says that each user interface that includes a visible text label, the accessible name must match it. And you're like, what do you mean the accessible name or the label? So we just talked about labels. Labels identify a control, and I'm going to go to the next page. But and generally the label is seen by all users. The name is what identifies the control to assistive technologies. So a screen reader, say. And the name, if you're familiar with HTML, there's a name attribute that you put on an input, for example, element. It's not the same. That's not what we're talking about. Oftentimes your name is the same as your label. So think about that link text. And if the visible text is what is the label, usually for the link. So alt text is also considered the accessible name for an image. The label can be the name, as I said, and then these ARIA attributes can as well. But if we go back, here we see we have these buttons that say learn more, learn more, learn more. And when I pulled up the list of buttons in my screen reader, that's all it said was clickable button, learn more, learn more, learn more. So think about, that's going to help the screen reader to have more descriptive text. And in theory, the visible text does match the accessible text, but it's not very meaningful. Now, what if I was somebody using voice control and I wanted to go and dive into that on the lower left, empowering our communities, and I wanted to click that link? Well, what would I say? I'd say, learn more, and which button is it going to invoke? And then they've done the same thing here. There's links that also just say learn more. And we talked about why those are problematic. So let's do a more practical example. If I look here, this is a pizza delivery place, and it, based on the address that I put in, because I wanted to order from the closest, or I wanted pickup, if I wanted delivery. So there's 3 locations. And as we're visually looking at this screen, we can see that it goes across the screen from left to right and order, carry out, pickup. But there's 3 buttons that say order, carry out, pickup. So if I was a screen reader user and I popped up that list of buttons, I wouldn't know which to pick. If I was a voice input, like someone using Dragon Naturally Speaking, and I think we'll see more people using voice control because that's coming in the next version of OS X for the Mac. But anyway, what could I do as a voice input user? How would I know to phrase that? If I said order, carry out, pick up Westford, that might not be how that was coded underneath, or I could say Westford, order, carry out, pick up. I don't know, so it makes it much more difficult. I have to sort of guess and maybe get to the wrong place. So basically, just by changing this, so I've now changed the buttons to say order, online order, carry out to Westford order, carry out. So now the text matches what's going to happen. So again, I've made this be more, each button unique, or each link unique on the page. And it's easier for people using a screen reader or who are using voice input to interact with those controls. Input purpose. And I'm not stopping for questions because we have a lot to go over, but I'll try to leave some time for questions. Input purpose is basically you use autocomplete. So that's, again, more of a HTML kind of thing, attribute that you would add to your input controls. But what they do is anytime you use a field that collects personal data, you want to explicitly say what data you're looking for. And you do that via this autocomplete attribute. And to show you how that works, I have added my Knowbility address and my personal address into my browser. And I have this form, and somebody might not quite understand WRK name, WRK address. Okay, you and I might, but someone with cognitive disabilities might be confused as to what goes there. But as soon as I put focus into this field, because it's been marked with the autocomplete, I'm offered a choice of, oh, it wants your full name. Which one do you want to use? So I went and I picked my Knowbility address. And as you can see, once I made one selection of my name, it filled in all the other fields based on the information I had added into Google. And this is important for people. Some people have a really bad memory, or they have some kind of a traumatic brain injury that they can't remember their phone number, or they can't remember the nuances of their address or their zip code. So by placing this information in there, it can automatically be input for them, and it makes it much, much easier. This is the start of personalizing the web a little bit more for all people. So we're going to jump again. Again, I'm following the order of the judging form. So that's why we're judging from keyboard back to a keyboard related thing. So all active elements must receive visible focus. So first off, we have to make sure that we can get to all those elements with the keyboard, but then once we're there, we need to see which element actually has focus. So imagine coming in here, and if I started tabbing and I didn't know where focus was. I could hit tab key and I could press down and invoke a link, but I would not know which link I was invoking. So it's very important that you make sure that all of your elements have visible focus. And this is, again, another place where using an accessible template from a content management system like WordPress, and I talk about WordPress because that's what I know, it will make a difference, or you'll have to do some hand coding to make sure that the focus is visible. Text sizing and reflow, again, this is another one that you'll want to choose your template correctly. Basically, one of the items of this is that you need to be able to resize content up to 200% and still have it flow properly. Nothing gets cut off. So this is example here shows a screenshot of the Knowbility site at 100% on my machine, my screen size. And then I've used browser zoom to go up to 200% and check that everything's still, nothing gets cut off, everything kind of reflows there. So that's the first part of text sizing. Then we have reflow, or responsive design is what I really think makes more sense. It says when magnification level is increased to 400%, which is a common magnification level for people that use screen magnification who have low vision, content must reflow so that left-right scrolling is not needed to view the content. Because think of how hard that is. I mean, if you want to mimic what a person using a screen magnifier uses, you know, make a little hole like a straw with your hands, you know, cup your hands and look down through your fingers from your, no, and think about reading a web page through that through a straw, right? And how hard that would be to go back and forth all the time and keep your place. So to show that, basically I've taken, again, another standard view on my desktop of the Knowbility screen, and we can see it's split into two columns. We have our community programs and then our services. But when I zoomed it out to 400%, everything went down into one column, so I don't have to scroll left and right. I only have to scroll up and down, so that browse all our programs is up here, and then our services comes directly below that rather than being placed over to the right. So again, responsive design. Make sure if you're using a content management system, you start with a template that implements that. Text spacing is another one. So some users need to be able to increase the spacing between letters or between words or between lines of text and paragraphs so that they can read it. It could be because of vision issues. It could be because of cognitive issues or even dyslexia that people need to change the spacing. This one's, you have to use a bookmarklet in order to test it. That's the easiest way to test it. Basically, a bookmarklet is a piece of JavaScript that you inject into the page as a link. Basically, you make it a bookmark in your browser and you run this little piece of JavaScript when you're on the screen, and it will adjust the text sizing for you. Again, there's a link in here and in the training. And this one, I have to say, most people do right. I had trouble finding a bad example that broke. Basically, the moral of the story is not to use fixed sizes when you're doing your CSS. So if you're hand coding any CSS, be careful not to use anything that's fixed size. So we can see on the right-hand side where I've made that visible, that you can see how the spacing has changed and some of the text overflows. Oftentimes it will get cut off, actually. In this case, it's overflowing and the user can still read it, but also it could be cut off completely and not visible. Now again, this one is not as commonly seen and as long, so you shouldn't have too much to worry about that, but you definitely want to test for that and probably test early if you're using a template to make sure you're not going to run into those kind of issues. So there are some exceptions. If you have video captions, we don't expect you to have to change the spacing on those. Images of text obviously won't change. So we don't like to use images of text, but sometimes an image contains text. So that does not have to meet that requirement. Logos that have text do not have to that. I'm guessing most of you won't be using Canvas, but that doesn't have to be. And then the success criteria, SC, cannot be achieved for PDFs if you're including PDFs. So now, it used to be there was only basic usability things after this, but now we have a few more. But spelling, you lose a point for each spelling mistake, okay? So check your spelling, and I did purposely misspell spelling at the top of this, but it's easy to look it over, especially if you've been doing a lot with the site and looking at it a lot. You want to have somebody else read it. If you can, learn how to use the screen reader, that's a great way, is to have the screen spoken to you either through a screen reader or through text-to-speech. Orientation, make sure you adjust the content of the orientation to the user device and preference. So here we have, a phone, say, with a picture of a woman, or heads facing up. If I turn the phone to the left and then the top of the woman's head faces to the left, no, that won't work. You need to make sure that you adjust to the orientation of the device if you're going to be supporting mobile devices as well. The reason for this is that some people fix their devices. So think of someone may have an iPad attached to their wheelchair, or they may be using an iPad to communicate through symbols. So it's important that your page is still visible when the device gets moved and the user has set a when they don't, so that if they have a specific orientation set, your content will adjust to that orientation. This content, don't avoid moving, blinking, or flashing content, and think twice about carousels. So this slide does have moving content. You should always warn someone if you're putting moving content in that lasts for more than 3 seconds. So I'm going to click through and you'll see some examples. A little spinning star. Is that really worth it? It does run and stop, so it's okay. Or this, pulsing text. That's okay as long as it stops after 3 seconds and doesn't do it too much. Carousels, everyone seems to love carousels on websites. They can be ones that auto advance can be very, very distracting. Someone that's trying to read further down the page and something's flying across their screen, that can be really distracting. So if you must have a carousel, or your client insists on one, my advice is to make it manually move forward. If they really want it to move forward, make sure that you absolutely include a way to stop that movement that's accessible with the keyboard. So this particular one that I pulled this off of did automatically move, but they also did have buttons here to move. They could have stopped it, and they did provide buttons, as long as they're keyboard accessible, to manually go to the next page. And there's a great W3C tutorial on carousels and how to build them. Form controls, basically, we expect them to work as the default ones work. Date pickers, if you can use a date picker, make sure that they're accessible, or that you can at least enter the date directly in the field. So if somebody comes in and they can't navigate that calendar with the keyboard or the screen reader, that they can at least type in 204, the year, month, day, or whatever. But in order to do that, you have to make sure they know what format you would expect, right? Because this is non-standard, right? 214 year, month, day is not standard in the US. Normally we do month, day, year. So you have to make sure that you can tell people what format you want, and let them manually also type into that field. If you're using some of these filters, make sure it's fully accessible to the keyboard and to assistive technology, so that someone can start typing, but they can also arrow down into those filtered options. Your best bet is always to use the default controls. So again, be aware when you're picking a template, if you're using a template, or you're adding any plugins to your content management system, that you have made sure they're accessible. And I think I did leave a little bit of time for questions if we have them, because we'll go through the other half of the form in the session next week. So I can stop sharing, maybe, and see if there are any questions. I think people can unmute, right, Jillian?
Yep, they should be able to. Well, we have one question from the chat. Can you recommend any WordPress themes that are accessible?
I haven't looked in a while, but when you go into WordPress, you can filter, and there is an option to filter on accessibility. So there you can, you might want to, if they're not default WordPress themes, you may want to double check them yourselves and run through some of these items with them. But there are, I know there's a calendar that is accessible. I happen to use it on a site that I own. So there are accessible plugins and there are accessible themes, but you can search for them when you're looking for themes in the WordPress theme searcher. You can filter for accessible. And yes, I'll be sharing the presentation. This will be posted in that training on learning.knowbility.org into the AirU training that you folks have all been given access to. So either I've put everyone to sleep or I've overwhelmed them, or you just are also smart, you get it all. And I think you will have, you can ask questions, reach out through air.knowbility.org or through a mentor that you have if you have particular accessibility questions.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think that is it. I'm not seeing any additional feedback in the chat other than a lot of great jobs, Becky. I think that this was a really informative session, and like Becky said, we will be sharing this via learn.knowbility.org. So thank you guys. Learning, sorry. Yes, that's right. And we do have one question. When will we get your mentors assigned? Your mentors will be assigned right after the kickoff, at the same time that you're assigned your nonprofit. Great question. All righty, guys. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, bye-bye, thanks.
Bye.